I was like, but I feel so empty. I feel so empty. I don't know if there's substance inside. And I feel like I could be very chameleon-like everywhere, especially on the basis of excellence. I'll just fool myself so I can belong in every environment. And I didn't know who I was at all.
Hi, and welcome to the Story, a podcast where storytellers disrupt. I'm David Noroña.
And I am Fabiano Altamura.
And before we hop in with part 2 with our very lovely special guest, please remember to like, subscribe, follow. Give us that 5-star review, brother. Who do we have?
We are in the studio for part 2 with the famous Carrie Lloyd.
Well.
Carrie, thank you. Those stories from last time were very, very funny.
And traumatizing.
Well, listen, I mean, we will probably get some really interesting comments from those.
Yours.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, listen, if you can't share it with friends and with your listeners, who can you share it with? You know what I mean?
Well, also, I think I was just saying off air,
Mm-hmm.
it's lovely to be honest about the old days.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's very important if you don't have humor about these things, and I don't know where we go from there.
Well, and they happened, and we're not prudes.
No, and we've been kind
Segue into your book. You see what I did there? Segue.
I'm leaving again.
We're not all virgin monologues, wow.
No, the pun podcast.
The pun podcast.
If I knew.
So listen, you went into casting, then what? I'd love to explore from there how you ended up coming to the United States, because I mean, we did school together, and
10 years later.
Yeah, I mean, talk us through that 10 years and how you then came into the United States.
Well, after working in publishing, I came back down to London. I started working in post-production, mainly for high-end advertising. So this is where you've got agencies like M&C Saatchi, Ogilvy and Mather, Fallon, like all of those different high agencies that had more money per frame of film than feature films did. Yeah. So they were working with the likes of Ridley Scott's and those kind of people. So in between feature films, these guys were coming in and doing high-end adverts. So we're talking about the Hovis bread commercial that's a £2 million budget.
Which Ridley Scott directed, didn't he?
Yeah, it was for their 100th anniversary. I still watch it to this day because it's one of my favorites. Or then you've got the ones of like the Gorilla advert. I don't know whether you ever saw this one, but it's Cadbury's chocolate.
The drum?
The drum.
Oh, yeah.
It's a gorilla and playing drums, playing to Phil Collins.
Yeah.
I can feel it in the air tonight.
Oh, yes.
And he does the drum kick
Yes,
in.
Phil, yeah.
And all it is a 1-minute shot of basically this camera coming, the music's kicking in in the air tonight. And the nostrils of the gorilla flare. And it's a very lifelike gorilla. And then all you've got is a purple background, which with the colours for Cadbury's chocolate. And he plays the drums and then it just kicks back into like Cadbury's milk chocolate.
How do you pitch an idea like that?
We were watching it at M&C Saatchi when it came out. And I remember the creative director went, I hate them. Because they'd obviously had a very good, and what turns out is the creative director of that ad agency was the one that played the drums. He was wearing the gorilla outfit.
Oh.
So it boosted sales by 200%.
Good Lord.
And so it's just, for me, advertising became a whole new genre of storytelling.
Yeah.
And we're not talking the infomercials that you have in America. We're talking superb ideas that you can catch someone in 30 seconds. And it is an art form. And these think tanks and creatives, they were in pairs, basically. You had an art director and a copy director. And Graham Fink was the creative art director. And I worked for him. I was his exec. And he basically, I learned so much from him in 1 year. Most people couldn't handle it he was kind of like the Miranda Presley.
I was going to say in Devil Wears Prada. Yeah.
He was that for the advertising. He wanted to have the first iPhone in the UK. And I was like, I think Johnny Ive is going to have, considering he was the one that designed it, I think he's probably going to be okay, well, let me be the second one. And so he was that kind of guy, but there was an excellence on him that was extraordinary. And I kind of was terrified by him and adored him all at the same time. And really, really was stretched more than ever before, I think. Yeah.
I want to ask you a follow-up on this because in our culture, in a lot of charismatic kingdom culture, there's a lot of conversation and even theology built around perfectionism, excellence, striving, performance. And yet I know that you've traveled in our circles, even in the pastoral setting, and yet you still seem to be speaking highly of him. So I'm curious, with what you know now, how are you able to look back on those moments positively?
I think it's a great question because he was so extraordinarily talented. He was one of the top 20 art directors in the world, and his curiosity, and he's still he paints drawings right now with digital paint drawing. He uses his eyes to paint.
Oh. Good Lord.
And it's all it's extraordinary. So he's always at the forefront of cutting edge art and has the mind of wonder that like I've never seen before. And the stories, I could do a whole half-hour podcast about him just because he's the most extraordinary guy that literally we would have dinner table stories about him because he was just so unique and so brilliant. And that's part of what made him, he loved to find unique and unusual. I remember him hiring a art director who must have been about 20 years of age, smoked a pipe and looked about 85 years of age, but he loved him because he was so different and had such bonkers thinking. And so he absolutely relished in making sure that he never said no. He allowed people to go as wide and go against the boundaries as much as possible. He was never frightened of offending. And sometimes that could be ruthless and terrifying. But I then would look at the deputy creative director, and she bought, her name was Tiger, and she had 4
this is a show
posters, all exactly the same poster with different blacks. And she went, which one do you think, Carrie? Just make a decision. And I went, they look exactly the same. And she just went and walked off. And so she was very cutting. She was very much like Miranda Priestly. She was very cutting. But because she was so brilliant at what she did, there was this almost reverence around it. You talk about the difference between excellence and perfectionism. Perfectionism is cruel. Excellence is kind. And I would say perfectionism is a form of self-hatred. Excellence has grace to it. So it's always our best version. And stretching ourselves to grow continuously, but it's never cruel to each other. It's never cruel to the self.
Do you think we have a proper understanding of excellence in our culture?
No, not really. I don't think so.
What do you think we've mistaken it with or gotten confused about?
Perfectionism. I think we're terrified of excellence because we're worried it will be strife or perfectionism.
Yeah.
And I think also excellence for me is also unique. It's fresh. It's original. It's not necessarily what someone else has already done
derivative,
before. I think there's something really beautiful about when it's one of the things I did love about some of the leaders in this environment is they did actually have extraordinary excellence, but were very kind in it if we got it wrong.
Oh yeah.
And even going into the job working here as a pastor, so flip to having an advertising TV production company, that I decided to close that down, and I went on essentially a spiritual pilgrimage, if that made sense. I was either going to marry this guy or I wasn't, and we decided to sort of finish our company, and I went off on a sort of adventure. I was like, I've kind of done a lot of the things that I wanted to do. I've met anyone that you would want to meet in the industry. My friends are all becoming extremely successful in the industry by this point, and I was like, but I feel so empty. I feel so empty. I don't know if there's substance inside. And I feel like I could be very chameleon-like everywhere, especially on the basis of excellence. I'll just form myself so I can belong in every environment. And I didn't know who I was at all. And so coming into this, I was basically coming over to LA to try and see if I could get a job internationally. I'd always wanted to live in California. My uncle lived in California and was a mathematician and worked on the first reliability program for the first rocket that landed on the moon. So he made a lot of money with NASA. And then I came over and I was like, wow, Uncle has a really great life. And so I was like, well, maybe I should live in California. So I always had a clawing back to the States. I've got ancestors from the States as well. And so I just knew there was this bridge between, and I loved Hollywood, especially in the 90s, the late 90s. I would come over and just be wide-eyed about it and the Oscars and everything that was going on. And so once I kind of came into this environment, I really didn't care for favor or influence, or I was aware that I was about to leave it all behind for the sake of a tiny little town in Redding, California. And I felt it did feel like it was something I had to lay down, because I think I was attaching myself to success or names or that kind of thing, and it was ugly. It was
what year did you come to Reading?
I came to Reading in 2012.
Oh, yeah.
That's the same year that we all came.
We were all in the same year.
We were all in
we were in the same
year. We were the same
were
year.
we really?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I remember we were.
Yeah. I mean,
I don't remember.
I used to sit next to Claire and Bab.
Oh my God.
And they would have, Claire would prepare these cute little lunches and picnics, and I would sit and they'd eat their little carrots and their cucumbers. And then I'd get ADD and go drink my fourth coffee in, you know, the club.
Yeah, no, we
were
in the same year, and you were always dressed so elegantly, because not everyone else was.
I know, I was told off for that at some point.
No, you weren't. You were told off for dressing elegantly?
I came for my job interview, and after my job interview as being an RG passer, they were like, could you just dial it down a notch?
Are you serious?
Like,
well, because you didn't have
rude.
You weren't wearing the socks and the Birks and the
I wasn't.
And the flannel
sweats. You know,
they told you really to dial it down.
They were like, can you dial it down?
That's that's heretical to Fab, by the way.
I agree. And then I know I was like, but what about excellence in fashion? What do we do with that?
Yeah.
For me, it was play. Again, it was just playing.
It's an expression of who you are.
But I think sometimes, I think we've got to be very careful that in our own culture, if you've been brought up in this culture, that we don't judge someone on the outside of coming in and going, oh, well, they must attach their identity to what they wear.
Yeah, but it's all right for somebody to have tattoos on both arms and go, yeah, it's fine.
Totally.
You tone it down. How can I? What do you want me to wear?
I think it's just so quintessentially human. I think we always have this gravitational pull for most of us to just kind of fit in or to find a place. And so okay, so I feel like we may have hopscotched over a critical moment here, which is just this. To me, in my mind at least, it is a Grand Canyon chasm between marketing agency and sunny California, and you coming to a school of ministry.
Yeah.
And before we even go there, your TV show where you were sworn to...
the big silence.
Yeah, you got to tell us a little bit about, speaking of disruptive storytelling, you were a regular on a show.
I was on... I was in a 3-part documentary series, which had a riveting idea. How they got this greenlit is beyond my understanding, but they basically said, right, we're going to put 5 very busy people into 5 days of silence. And someone went, what a riveting idea for television.
Did you do that with Iona?
Staring into... No, she did the convent.
The convent.
So she did the convent. I remember watching
horror.
that.
Yeah, no,
and I was like, oh, I'd love to do 40 days out of my own life and just figure out what it is. Because my mother always wanted, before she met my father, wanted to possibly be in a convent. I kind of always had that sort of solitude, quite private, quite quiet thing in me. And so I remember going for... Actually, this might be an interesting thing to talk about as well. I remember I saw an advert in a newspaper, and the same producers of that show were now going to take, because of course with Iona's, that was 4 or 5 women, I can't remember how many, to do 40 days and 40 nights in a convent. And they did the same for men in the monastery for a separate show. So they did the convent and they did the monastery. And then those producers decided they wanted to do a mixed bag of people from busy, crazy, because they recognized in the silence of the solitude, it was bringing up a lot of triggers and a lot of trauma and also healing. So I go, oh yeah, great. And it's only 8 days. It's not 40 days. So I can probably take some time out. And I was just coming back from being in it. So I'd lost my faith 2 years after losing my father when I was 23. So I basically, I mean, we didn't have a word for it then of deconstructing, but I was I was just mad and I was angry. And so I became a very angry atheist, and I'm just reading the New Atheist and the New Atheist and just arguing every Christian under the table. So that's why I could kind of work quite well in the film industry, because they're all kind of the same. And when I was coming back to, and I mean, my testimony's out there somewhere, so I won't bring it all up in this particular moment, but in the encounters that I started having coming back to Jesus and coming back to Christianity, I was still playing a journey of like the kind of wayward wild child.
Yeah.
And a lot of attitude, not much focus on character, to be honest with you. In fact, zero airtime for it, to be honest with you. You know, it was all a matter of survival in the industry, really. And so when I came back to it, I was on this kind of journey, probably when I was about 29. It's probably about 3 years before I came into here to California. I did this 8-day silent retreat, and they'd actually said, sorry, we've chosen our 5, thanks very much. And then I got a phone call a week later saying actually one of them's done a psych test but they failed. I was like, oh my gosh, you do a psych test on people, which I forget, because they're putting you through a mentally challenging journey, really, on some level. So I basically changed everything, and they followed us for a week in our busy schedule. At that time, I was a TV producer, so it was a pretty
They did a background package on you.
They did a little montage for a week, yeah. And then we go into this 8 days of silence, and it was in a very, very quiet area in Wales, so it was in the middle of nowhere, and it was like Hogwarts.
You sent me a link. I've actually seen pieces of it.
Did you really?
You did.
Is it on YouTube?
I hope
you sent me something and I found it.
Wow.
And I think I saw you either on the trailer or on one of your episodes, but it exists out there somewhere.
You've got to send me the link.
Well, I went down to the pub the first night. I couldn't do it. I couldn't face it. And then they would be like, oh, you from St. Binos? I'd be like, how did you know? And they're like, yeah, they all come down. They all tried to escape the first or second night. And then third night, the producer was like, yeah, I'm sorry, you're going to actually have to take this seriously, because we're filming this. This is part of a production. And we kind of need you to stop being on your phone and stop chatting to people in the silent retreat. Lord. So I ended up going, okay, yeah, you're right. I should be, I'm sorry. I should be taking this seriously. But I was desperate to get away from silence, because it was so confronting to remove all noise, all talking, all music. I mean, you could play light music, and you could read, and you could have 1 hour with your mentor, your spiritual mentor, who mine was a woman called Sister Renata, and she was a German nun, and she was amazing, and she spoke so poetically. You could tell she read 1,000 books a day.
Wow.
Which, I mean, she had the time to.
Yes.
And then, but she was so incredible. What I didn't realize looking back then was that she was incredibly prophetic, and she would write things on notes and slide them under my door, and it would be exactly what I was processing, whether it was the death of my father, that kind of thing. But it was 6 years after the death of my father by this point, and I knew I had to start facing some stuff, because I just made the industry busy.
Yeah. Yep.
And I was busy, and I just wanted to be busy, so then I didn't have to
deal with it. Yeah.
And so it wild encounters in that space, and I didn't want to leave by the end of the 8th day.
Isn't that crazy?
And I didn't realize how much I lived by fear of man. I was constantly people pleasing, trying to make everyone happy, and I'd be crushed if I made them unhappy. That desire to fit in, I misconstrued as belonging. And so I realized the difference between, belonging is some people accepting who you are without trying to fit in and trying to be something that they are. So that cookie cutter thing that I was trying to even do in this environment of like, okay, I'll be whatever you need me to do. And, I'll try and never make a foot wrong and never try and get it wrong, because I was so still confused between perfectionism and excellism. Excellism?
It's a new word, yes. It's your new book.
And,
combination of exorcism and excellence.
Excellism.com. Just bought the domain.
Carrie, I want to go back, because that was a really brilliant distinction. Would you mind going back and just laying out for me the difference between belonging and fitting in?
Brené Brown talks about this, so I don't want to make out like I've come up with this revelation myself, but she basically said, there is a difference between fitting in and belonging. Fitting in, we change ourselves in order to belong to a community, a society, a family, a space. But belonging is actually, this is who I am, and I hope you're okay with that. And I'm not going to, because I'm not going to change it for you. It's essentially there's obviously a journey of being kind and healthy, emotional health. But there are times where, let's take the dressing thing. I remember being like kind of crushed that I had to like dial it down a bit. And I remember then Paul Manwaring came up to me. He opened a door for me when I was walking through. He said, by the way, Carrie, thanks for like upping the game on how we dress. And I went, oh, he said, I miss it. I miss the opportunity of dressing for enjoyment almost, or expression. I think you told me you actually said it to me in one worship set where you came up to me and said, by the way, how you dress is a worship to the Lord. an expression to the Lord. And I was like, oh yeah, that's what it is. That's why I was crushed, because I'm not attached to these things, but it's play for me. It's just play.
Yeah.
So the journey of fitting and belonging, I felt even with acting when I was in theatre, and that was my main forte. I didn't really do much TV or anything like that. It was mainly theatre because it was so much more alive and kicking, but much more terrifying. And because you're responding instantly to their responses. If it's a comedy, you need them to laugh. If it's, and for obvious reasons, you want to know that you're actually hitting the mark well. But it can crush you. And it's one of the reasons why I never actually fully became a professional actress, because I knew it would kill me on some level. I was so thin-skinned and so sensitive, especially as an only child. Never had sibling rivalry, never had that kind of roughhousing that you do with your siblings that kind of does give you a bit of resilience. I didn't have any of that.
Yeah. The two of you are only kids.
Yeah, only children.
There's a thing on it, isn't there? There's a thing with having
There is,
children.
yeah. Really
so I got to ask, you do this thing, and it sounds like you had a profound spiritual experience. You're then at BSSM, and I want to keep moving forward because I mean, you're an author and you've covered so much territory. When did you write your first book? What is it? What prompted you to do that?
I was actually a journalist probably around about the age of 30. A friend of mine was a really brilliant journalist and just had a wonderful life as a writer. And I was so inspired that she could travel anywhere and do it. And I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to be able to write. And I wrote all my life, but it was always very private and always to myself. It was cathartic. It was almost an incense to the Lord in certain ways. And it certainly helped me process things and avoided bitterness. I always had this thing of like, I want to always avoid bitterness as much as I can. And if I process well and process these things, it won't hold on to my body and it won't make me ill, and it also won't then launch an attack or revenge at other people. It might take a while, but I don't want to ever stay on bitterness on any part of my life. So it was part of a tool belt for me, really, writing. And then my friend said, you know what, I've got an editor here that's like so fascinated that I'm a hardcore atheist and you're back to your belief, and they want to do an article about you and I think it was, I can't remember if it was Company Magazine or Glamour Magazine. It was one of those two. So we did a double-page spread for that, and people were so fascinated. And I loved talking about and writing something in print and then other people feeding back. It was a conversation, basically, and writing started the conversation.
Yep.
And so she was the pioneer of pushing me in front of editors, and so I started writing. I even wanted to make sure that I wasn't getting the gigs because of my well-known writer friend. I wanted to make sure I was being hired for my own skill set. There was a competition in one particular magazine for a writing competition. And I decided I'm going to try and, it was about the argument between why online shopping and like in-person shopping.
Is that how you became the Carrie Bradshaw of the faith world?
That's exactly it.
Is that what it was? Is that
actually,
how it was?
Yes, it was the same editor. She was the one that gave me the first.
Because wasn't your original blog called Her Glass Slipper?
Her Glass Slipper.
Yeah.
And so one of the editors at large for Grazia magazine said you should write a blog on Christian dating because no one talks about it in England. And I think even humanists would find it really interesting. So I think you should write. So she was the instigator of that. I started writing single page spreads about fashion and loving Jesus too. And like we would start really cheesy surface level things, but they were instigating a conversation.
Yeah.
And then from that point, I then did the Her Glass Slipper, started writing a blog just because it was good practice, just to see and engage what was inspiring people to think.
Building muscles, sure.
Yeah. And it was vulnerable. Writing is very vulnerable because you are ready for an attack at any moment. And so I remember doing all of that. And then the next thing was a friend was doing a book review in a radio station. And she said, do you want to come along? And it was a season of my life where the Lord was like, please just say yes to everything. Even if it's random and so off piece, you don't understand why. And so I was like, okay. So I went to this thing and I just sat in the studio listening to my friend doing a book review. It was a different friend to the one that I mentioned earlier. And I went to the restroom and there was this woman that had folded herself up like a lawn chair in the sink so she could do her makeup. And I went, oh, I'm so sorry. Didn't mean to. She went, I wasn't expecting anyone to come in this moment. I said, I see that. I'm so sorry. And she was like, so anyway, Carrie, what are you doing here? And I said, oh. And then I heard distinctly the Lord said, you've never given yourself the name of writer. Say writer. You're a writer.
Oh, wow.
Because I was in between producing bits and bobs. And I said, I'm a writer. And she said, oh, what do you write? I said, have this blog called Her Glossy. I was like kind of embarrassed. I was showing I've just literally read a piece from that. Someone sent it to me, and I was going to reach out to you and see if we could put it on our network.
Oh my
and
gosh.
So that was radio, websites, and it was probably one of the biggest networks for Christian. Premier
Christian Radio, yeah.
And so that was that. About a month later, I wrote an article called Goliath's Gonads. And
brilliant.
obviously one has developed a lot since then.
It'd be called Goliath's Cajones now.
Oh, I might have done it in French
exactly
if I'd had you around. But I basically, and this tagline was, will all the strong men please stand up in the church?
Hello.
Ouch. I was an aggressive writer at that point. And I learned a lot. There are these times that editors really like, can you just calm it? You're packing a punch. Can you just calm it down? But it was part of the sort of joviality of how I would write, really. Yeah. And so, anyway, the next thing I knew was I got this email from a publisher saying, I'd like to think that I'm a strong man and I'm go to church. Slightly offended by your article. However, I kept reading and I wondered if you've ever wanted to write a book. And his name was Malcolm Down. He was in a publisher in England, and to this day he's still a dear friend of mine. I thank a lot to him for because I just never planned to do that, and I didn't want to write a book because I was earning more per article than I would for an advance for a book.
Yeah.
But I said, probably about 3 weeks before, I kept getting all these words about writing a book, and I thought, yeah, of course you say that. And then I remember some stranger in the Philippines then said it, and I thought, okay, now I'm listening.
Yeah.
You have no concept that I'm a journalist or a writer.
Yeah.
And so I sat down with Lou and I went, all right, you got two options. And he went, oh, do I? And I said, yeah. One option is you either just land a book deal in my lap, or you give me the desire and the heart to want to write a book. So I bashed down every door to make it happen. And so 3 weeks later, that's when I got that email from Malcolm. I said, well, give me 24 hours. And then I said to the Lord, I need a dream. And then it's 24 hours to give to him as a book idea because I haven't got one. That's when the Virgin Monologues came up, because I'd seen the Vagina Monologues a long time
of
ago.
course, yeah.
And so I wanted to kind of to a spin on it. I always like seeing something that might be very successful in the secular world and do a spin on it.
Yeah, of course.
To make all things good. And then so that in itself was I'm really glad I wrote the book. I wouldn't write it the same way now.
Yeah.
I feel like the Virgin Monologues, I was about to say the other one, the Virgin Monologues and Prude were like my teenage diary.
Yeah, great.
And then the Noble Renaissance felt like my actual first adult book.
And the Virgin Monologues, that was the book you bought the manuscript to in second year, wasn't it?
I did. I bought it into our Reviver group. And prayed over.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I remember that.
I was terrified. And you said the third book will be bigger.
Was it?
Do you remember that?
I do.
That was the contract with HarperCollins. And then my publisher, the first publisher, went, sorry, I don't think I can afford you anymore, Carrie, because, I'd love to do another book with you. And I said, well, how about we go back to the very first amount of advance that you gave me for my first book, because I owe you one. And so we did the legacy letters because it was a really easy book to write. It wasn't going to take me very long to write it. And so it's been lovely to go kind of do a full circle with Malcolm. And hopefully now he's sort of got his own hybrid print company. I wanted to kind of like pour back into his business just as he had done with my career. And so it's been a lovely journey in writing. It's been really lovely, even with Bill writing, working on his Holy Spirit book that he's doing, and he's about to do his one with Benny. And so just talking about writing different subjects, especially something as vulnerable as Benny, making sure that he does it from a space that he's never written from before. He's very educational as a revelatory writer. So I love sparring this kind of stuff with writers. It's just one of my favorite things to do. And so, I was like, you got to go deeper, Bill, on this one, because you go very deep with revelation, but this is a vulnerable book. And for any reader to understand that you really are believing in his goodness in the hardest time of your life, then you have to show us some of the hardest parts of this, because then you can't be argued against anymore. When someone said, well, you've had a great life. Well, of course God's good for you. Yeah. Now he's gone through a journey of this. Yeah. It's like, now he's got the authority to say it in a way like never before. And yet So the poise of writing in such a vulnerable season is very difficult. And I really do think for all writers that are going through a really difficult journey, or they want to write about their story and sell their story, have enough time away from it to make sure that you're getting enough revelation of how the Lord romances you. I didn't want to write the Virgin Monologues because I wasn't married.
Right.
And I was like, I said to Jake Veach, my pastor, I was like, I just don't think I should write it. And he was like, why not? Well, I don't have like, here's what you can with in Christian dating. I've got all the ways not to do it.
Yeah.
But I don't have any way of like, he said, oh, so you only can write a story if you know the victory. And I went, yeah. And then I realized, I think we're coming into a generation now. It goes, the testimonies are wonderful, but I also want to hear how you're being romanced.
The process,
of course.
Before you've got the testimony. Can you just share a bit? That keeps us strong, that keeps us going.
Yeah.
That's a testimony in itself of how he romances us in the journey of like the unknown answers.
So then you move from, you write the Virgin Monologue,
you
then write Prude. How do you go from being in school to then becoming a pastor?
Yeah.
So what happened there?
I do. I ran. I didn't want to do it at all. And I remember this was true because I remember both the overseer of second year and then obviously a senior pastor, they were like, no, I think we need you in here because you've got a very different background to the majority of other RGs. You've been an atheist, so you have an understanding of people that are younger believers, but also you have a grace for the secular world that I don't have. So therefore, we need people like you. And I really did appreciate the diversity of what they brought with people in this environment. I really have.
It's pretty big thinking for a church environment to actually appreciate.
Yeah, especially when they've got such strong structures of morality and a moral compass. So there were times that I was seen as the risky pastor. And so I never felt, there were times in my own insecurity, I was like, I'm never going to be enough for these guys. Like that's how I felt. And yet at the same time, I would see the Lord's kindness in all these moments of the students that were brought to me. I loved seeing where when you say yes and you don't feel completely disqualified, how embryonically you start to come out because you start to realize, this was the stuff that he wanted me to say yes to. I was just chickening out. Like the mountain was me. It wasn't anyone else. And so I remember speaking and sitting down with the senior pastor and went, we're all great as friends. I'm just worried if I come and work for you, that may not happen anymore. And I'm worried that I'm going to let you guys down. And in my perfectionism, I don't want to. So they were like, you're going to get it wrong. You're going to get it wrong. And I'm like, that's why I don't want to. And they were like, but you see, unlike your other jobs where, and I explained that I had like typewriters thrown at me and telephones thrown at me, or like just sheer humiliation in front of an entire office. Like when you get it wrong in a high kind of risk environment, you really do get berated and can be screamed at down all sorts of interesting communication devices. So he said to us, what if we still loved you when you get it wrong?
Wow.
And I went, well, that's brand new information to me. I've never heard that before. And so that's when I knew I had to say yes, because I knew it was going to start working on my character.
Wow.
A lot of the things that I backed away from were adverse moments that I should have faced in order to build my character. And there's that lovely book at the moment going around, the coddling of the American mind and why we're setting up the next generation for failure, because we're all avoiding adversity as much as possible on the helicopter parenting and the lawnmower parenting. That was a big part for me of like, I've got to start facing it. If I'm going to start facing it, then it's probably best I do it in a safer environment. And so that's why I said yes. And I had the number 3, which I knew I'd do 3 years.
Did you do 3 years?
And I said that even in my interview, because I didn't want to say, I'll be here forever. And then I'm like, no, 3 years. So Chris asked me, how many years would you do? And I said 3 years, I think. And then I carried on being a pastor outside the environment of Bethel to Leaders Network, which I found fascinating because I love crisis management, to be honest with you. So if pastors were in a crisis in any church over America, we go back to the story. We're in Act 2 of the battle and the chaos and the crisis. And so okay, so what's the happy ending here? How do we find restoration? How do we find reconciliation? And what are the strategic diplomatic conversations we need to have that include everyone together?
You were perfectly positioned for that. I mean, given your background, this was like, oh, I can do this now.
Yeah.
I know the world. I know crisis out there.
Yeah. And I think, I'd have to say, I just did an article on narcissism in the church, and it's been a really fascinating subject to discuss, because I'm like, even researching it, I was just so convicted of myself. And I thought, gosh, there's 6 conversations I had when I was a pastor that I wish I'd done differently, that I kind of bulldozed my way in, and I didn't give them space to talk about their own framing of their own understanding of the same story. Because I was of a authoritative space, I kind of gaslit them, if I'm honest. And I didn't give them the space to go, well, I'm in pain here. And so all of those skill sets in pastoring and in what we learn in community and koinonia in church are vital everywhere, whether you're in the industry or any industry, any corporate environment. What does good character, what does a noble character look like?
Yeah.
Carrie, as we wrap part 2 with you, I'm curious. You've had such an amazing journey and traveled through so many different worlds and picked up so much insight. And you've been inside and outside, and even in these weird hybrid dimensions of the church. What do you see from your perspective, from your vantage point, happening in the church that encourages you? And what is the biggest challenge facing the church as you see it?
I mean, I think I wrote about narcissism because I think that's one of the biggest challenges we're having in the moment. Culture teaches culture how to do things. And so I think we've learned patterns from previous generations. I'm not blaming the generation for that, because we have some very humble people in those generations too. But I think we can get very comfortable in our structures and in our environments and how things are done. And I think if we go back to an anti-narcissism gospel, which is Paul's letters to the Corinthians, then we're much more likely to have a dynamite church. And I really do feel like, I mean, even writing, I know some of the SLT from Bethel were like, gosh, this is making me think about some things. And
SLT, by the way, is senior leadership team. No, it's okay. Yeah. And
then so many people have been reaching out going, I'm burnt out, I'm broken, I've been really hurt by the church, and I don't know what to do with my faith anymore. Like we are in a crisis because at some point we took advantage of their heart to serve and honor. And I think in that space, we're continually growing. So we need to have grace for people that have got it wrong. I don't know I think we're led so much with a justice button at the moment. We're not really a safe environment for people to go, I got it wrong, and confession. So when we're throwing out a lot of these articles around, I'm like, we're delaying perpetrators to come back and repent. And we need to try and find a way that we navigate crisis on a local church level, not international level, because that's where it can get very cloudy and all sorts of crazy stories go around. And then I think on the things that I think are actually really exciting to hear. I mean, I'm still obsessed with the church movement going on in Iran, because there are no assets, no names. We don't know who's leading the movement. It's just women that got absolutely mesmerized by the gospel and have to risk their own lives every single day by delivering the gospel to somebody else. So it's quick and it's fast, and discipleship is very, very quick. And so the movement is huge. Mosques are emptying. And that in itself is purely because we went back to a very humbling focus on the gospel and the anti-narcissist, which is the sleeping on crates. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of all money or anything like that, because I think what the church does in their wealth can do extraordinary things for those that are the voiceless. That's the whole point of us raising money as churches and tithing, is to be able to give voice to the voiceless. And that's what authority is supposed to do as well. So if we are given authority, are we holding and stewarding it well, so we never take advantage of it, and then we never use it for our own ego or pride or puffed up sense of insecurity, that we're actually using it for the voiceless.
How would you define then a narcissist?
I think she'd be better positioned to do this, given that she's just interesting, because I understand narcissistic tendencies, but how would you define a narcissist in your opinion?
I'll send you my article after this one, because it explains it all. But basically, it's you can have a personality disorder of narcissism, for sure. But I actually feel like it's all within our reach, especially when we're in pain.
Yeah.
So we can stop forgetting about having empathy. There's normally no empathy from a narcissist. We're normally not giving any space to allow them to talk or explain. The desire to try and cover up your reputation continuously whilst deflecting and gaslighting the other person, or even projecting accusations to the other person now that they feel they're being attacked. I think if we start to ask the question, how do I affect you? It really opens up a really fascinating conversation. It's both hard to hear and very insightful. And then that's where we can start to find areas of growth. It's our accountability again. And I think the more we separate ourselves in the sites of celebrityism in church, when we start to separate ourselves from that, then we start to get actually quite lonely, disconnected. We then start to feel pain, and then more separation happens because now we have to live up to the facade we've been living out there. And before you know it, then we start doing things that we really we don't know at that point when we got that big or that massive or everyone's eyes on you. Then you get so isolated that you can't even turn to your local comrades and go, I'm struggling here and I'm about to do some really dark things, you know.
Chris just shared a story a few weeks ago about Jack Hayford and how Jack, it was a beautiful story where Jack apparently confessed that he was struggling. He did this openly in a conference or a chat where he shared this, but basically he was having thoughts about his secretary. He immediately
he shared
it openly
in front of 900 other leaders at a conference or something, wasn't it?
That's right.
I hope he told his wife first.
Yes. I mean, I think
he told her after.
She found out during the sermon.
Dear.
There was a big what?
At the beginning of phone call.
Exactly like
he put himself in accountability for over a year to navigate these things. So to Carrie's point, there's one thing that I've always found unusual and kind of surprising about narcissism, and that is that it actually is usually an emanation of a very weak ego. You would think the opposite.
I thought it was very arrogant.
It's counterintuitive, isn't it?
Chuck did an amazing book on it, When Narcissism Comes into the Church, and he said it's actually coming from shame and insecurity, which is fascinating. But
it's evident though, right? Isn't it? Do you not think it's evident? Anybody that overcompensates,
you would think it doesn't present itself that way, but the thing about it is because there's a weak ego there, they constantly have to reinforce in this kind of almost Death Eater sycophant way. So they need you to constantly be reinforcing their thing.
When you see it now, when you're healthy and you see it now, it's just obvious that it stems from an insecurity.
Yeah, it's so true.
You know,
and also I think one of the fascinating parts about de Groot's book, because I interviewed him for the article, and it was interviewed because he basically said that there's a couple of, you talked about what's going on. He said, we're actually in a Reformation of the church comes every 500 years. We're in that now. We're in that new Reformation. And so that's where I think some of this thing of like reevaluating, reflecting, looking at ourselves. You've got the younger generation that are like, we need an honest conversation. You've got the older generation that could live on the testimonies for another century, quite frankly, because there's such great giants of the faith. But it's kind of like the younger generation are on Titanic going, there's an iceberg ahead. And the older generation going, well, let's keep playing the violin. So it's kind of that journey that I was explaining in the article. And de Groot says it's not as obvious as like the big personalities or the big charmers, or they can be very introverted. They can be very different slants and personalities attached to narcissism. So it's not necessarily played out as the big brash shouter, you know.
One of the big inoculators, I remember I've shared this story with you, but I was having a hard time at work, at church, surprisingly, and I was working for music at the time. And I remember waking up and I was feeling super heavy. My wife was noticing it. And I remember just one simple prayer. I said, Lord, my feet were hanging over the thing. I could barely get out of bed to go to work, which is very unusual for me. And I heard the Lord, I said to the Lord, I just need to feel the dust of the gospel on my feet.
Ooh.
And I went to work, and Chris Estes, who was one of the major guys over at the label, he was my boss at the time. And in our one-on-one, he just says, blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, one of our teams is going to Iraq. And I perked up. I said, who's going to Iraq? What do you mean? Who's going to Iraq? I was like one of the senior producers. I was like, how do I not know that we're sending a team to Iraq? 5 minutes later, he says, do you want to go? This is the morning that I prayed what I prayed.
Wow.
So good.
And I said yes. And I went. And then I ended up in tents with Arab people who had had encounters with Jesus, a Yazidi man who had been lit on fire and didn't burn, who had had these deep encounters with Jesus, little girls, a little girl who couldn't lift her hand past her waist, who got healed on camera while we were filming because her parents, who had just gotten saved, prayed for her. Everywhere you went in this UNICEF refugee camp, there was literally dust on your feet. And they had a kind of a minor little civil war shut down airports. We barely got out of the country, and I came back and was absolutely shaken to the core, because I think we become self-consumed when we're staring at ourselves and our own navels all the time. The moment you face somebody in who has actually been, whole people groups who have been raped and decimated, 100%. Then you go, oh, apparently I'm not the center of the universe. Jesus, thank you for that reminder.
100%.
It'll cure you like that.
Fostering children was the thing for me. That was a turning point for me. That changed me completely. Watching these kids be so resilient and so phenomenal, and my heart was breaking every single day of what they wanted to go through, especially having to live with me. That's
How was it?
They go through all of that, like being robbed from their homes, court case in the afternoon, and then over they come to a Harry Potter house with a British woman who doesn't make any
with
sense.
a Gucci bag.
Walks around like Coco Chanel.
How did you find fostering?
I was terrified.
First
time I did it. And I still am terrified of the prospect of doing it now, because each case is so different. But I learned patterns of similarities between each one of them. And I also learned a lot about trauma and how we can really use trauma to not grow up. And then there are other kids that are like, that happened, but I'm not going to let it define my journey. And my first was an 11-year-old boy who pretty much was acting like an 18-year-old because he was taking care of his other 3 younger siblings. And father was in jail. Mum and dad were pretty dead. I think they'd come out of a domestic violence situation. But it was a really stunning journey to watch, because one of the other mothers of one of these children, she'd also lost her children in foster care for a couple of years. And she turned to me the day before I was about to go and see the bio mum. And she said, just so you know, we hate you. We hate you. In regards to like, you're the shiny one with teeth coming in and telling us, here are your children. They're doing so well at my home. And I went, I can totally understand why that would feel the case. So I had to have a creative understanding of how do I let her know when I come in the room that I'm not wanting to have her keep her children. I'm not trying to replace her. And so this is where the Lord comes in. And he would wake me up in the middle of the night if the child needed something, like, because I was always worried, especially as a single, I was worried that I wouldn't have a husband to help me in this journey. So Holy Spirit was incredibly powerful in these moments, especially living on the brink, on the risk of edge like that. Always slightly terrified that you might traumatize them even more. And especially because I was new, I needed a lot of help and guidance. And I just remember going into this room in CPS, and I had this boy carrying 2 pots of flowers, one for her and one for his stepdad. And he ran over and said, we got you these. And she looked up, she was ready to like kill me with her eyes. And when she saw the flowers, she looked at me again, she came over, gave me a hug. And I said, he said such wonderful things about you. And she went, thank you. Okay, thank you. And then I'll leave you be. And then just left it off. And it's just these moments of like, I want to be the last person that's trying to make you not feel shameful. The things that you must have gone through pain yourself. This is probably what you were modeled, and you didn't know how to take care of your kids. Or you're in a codependent relationship and you don't know how to have a voice. Whatever the reasons are, serving changes everything for me. And I think that's the part when I'm looking to help other people, all of a sudden my life gets a lot easier and a lot better.
It's crazy to think that maybe that's what we're actually wired to for, that brings us purpose and fulfillment. Carrie, you are the very definition of a disruptive storyteller. Thank you so much. It's always so cool to hang out with you and to hear what you're up to.
It's such an honor.
You're like a female 007. She's always got a new adventure.
I'd love to be that. Could I be? Just call me Bond.
Jane Bond. Well, you've been watching Story Podcast with the amazing Carrie Lloyd. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you.